So today we're going to be myth busting a couple of ideas that some of our UX designer folks and maybe some people outside of design may have. Let's get started. So the first fallacy would be the more features that you have, the better your product is. And I think this is a concept that a lot of people think, makes better sales. If you just look into the products that you use in a day-to-day, like the applications that you have, maybe you'll realize that the ones that people gravitate the most to are the ones that are very simple. So think about something like Google. So everyone I know uses Google Docs now. And what they do is they try to make everything streamlined. They still have advanced features, but it's not something that you particularly see in the interface. So even if you do have a lot of features, it's very important to keep it simple so that when a first-time person or a first-time customer starts using that, they won't feel overwhelmed with the amount of things that they need to learn. And this is so true because when I was thinking about what happened in Config today, when they were announcing all the new features that were coming along, it really resonated with me when they said that they thought about it really hard whether or not they should take out some features or just simply redesign it. So there's like two paths there where you have so many features but you don't really know which one to sunset or to take away. Then another option would be to hide those things that are not really serving your customers well, and then figure out like after some time, do you still need it or not? The takeaway here is you really need to pay attention to what your customers love and just make sure that that is what is being shown. The next thing is the myth that good design is universal, or a good strategy, for example, is universal. But keep in mind that every single business out there has its own unique approaches to solving problems. So what has worked for Google, such a big company, or Uber when it first started, might not work out for a small startup or like a solopreneur. You really do have to pay attention to like what are the factors that has contributed to the success of an approach, and just be mindful that despite something like being very good for one particular industry doesn't mean that it will always apply the same way when you apply it with the problem that you're trying to solve, because the context may differ. Again, we're going back to the core concept of like you have to know your audience, you have to know who are your users, and I don't want to keep saying users because like there is a stigma around it now that I'm hearing. We have to refer to users as people too, like who are the people who love your product, and then try to figure out like what do they need and want. So maybe some things, think about how old are they, how tech savvy are they, where are they coming from, what cultural nuances do they have, what are the questions that they usually say when they talk to your customer support, what are the problems that they normally have when first coming up to like using your product, whether it's a physical thing or a digital thing. It's important to get to know them first, so that when you're trying to come up with a solution and you're copying something that's already existing from a particular a niche that might be relevant, then you're not making the mistake. The next myth that I want to bust is once the prototype is done, then the design is over. So actually, this depends. This depends because in a freelance setting, sometimes you might have projects where what they want of you is just the prototype. Maybe what they want of you is just like the mock-ups or the high fidelity designs. In reality though, design in UX in particular, you do not stop until like even after something has shipped. Design is there from once you've completed the thing, that you pass it over and you hand it over to your developers. You still have to watch out for how did they actually build it. So there's an element of quality assurance wherein you're constantly checking, are the interactions correct, are the motions or the graphics or animations correct, spacing, the copy, the content, are the flows actually being followed, and are your validation or interaction notes being followed? Is it accessible if you're paying attention to accessibility, and how does it scale from like or is it responsive for like a desktop, mobile, or a tablet view. So these things, sometimes you can't really, when you're building something, you might have a really good idea and might look perfect at first, but then you find out that much later on there might be issues that crop out. So in my experience, when I'm supporting like a development team or like a tech trio where you have your product manager and your developers and myself as a designer, I find that there are technical issues that sometimes crop up, and those are very important to highlight just because it may change the design direction pretty fast once you know that like certain things can't even be done, and there are things that developers can't do at the start. They have to actually try to do it, so they may think that it's possible, but then when they start implementing it, they realize it's not possible. So it's not usually something as easy as, let's say, when you're creating a visual. So if you're just creating a visual for a social media marketing campaign, for example, you just create the visual, you send it over to the marketing team, and then it's done. But if it's something like creating a prototype and you're building an app or a physical product, there's going to be rounds and rounds of testing. So once you launch the product, it might have been that you tested a small segment of users and you found people, and you found a lot of problems in that area. You fixed all those problems and you realized that once you've actually launched it, there are more problems. So again, just going back to the concept that it is a myth. Prototyping is the end of design. You really have to measure things too. Like, one thing that hiring managers and people in the industry are looking for is like, what is the return on investment in UX? Like, what do they get out of you being involved in this project and how successful the project is? If you're not tracking something, then you will never know how good it is. So I would advocate for those as well. Like, once you launch something, what are the leading and lagging indicators? It's something that some teams don't pay attention to as much. So I'd advocate that at the very start, at least you have a goal so that you can measure if you actually succeeded, or you sort of met it halfway, or you really need to figure out what other ways could you do after launch to meet that original goal. I think I blabbered on there, but yeah, just wanted to give you an idea of like the stuff that you need to do after you deliver your prototype. The next myth is a very easy one. It's the idea that users do not scroll. They only pay attention to above the fold, for example. So I've talked to a lot of people, and I know that that's the first thing that they see, but there's enough experiences out there, like for example Facebook, LinkedIn, people who want to keep reading comments, especially in YouTube, for example. As long as the content is engaging, sometimes people are addicted to scrolling. There's just so many examples out there. So I know that like it is very difficult to just keep grabbing someone's attention, but if you do have it and they're very interested in your content, like for example reading a book online or a novel, then they will stay there and try to finish it as long as they find it engaging. Okay, the next thing is click count. So I've talked to a couple of people in the past, and sometimes they tell me that they're very particular about the number of clicks. Like, the less clicks, the better. But actually, if you think about some of the experiences that we currently have, people pay attention to the simplicity and the ability to actually understand every single thing, having the context of like what they're doing and not being bombarded by information. So a big example of this pattern is a wizard, for example. So a wizard is something like a step-by-step process in setting things up. You usually encounter this when you're applying for something or you're setting up an account and it has many steps. And so if you do that like in one huge form, yes, you're gonna have less clicks, like less next and back buttons, but it could be very overwhelming for a person to just look at a form that's maybe like that has 20 to 40 fields. If you approached it in a way where you segmented everything in single different pages, then it might be easier for your customers or the people that need that service to actually go through it. And for me as well, it's like I get overwhelmed when I'm filling up a form that's like super long. They lack chunking. And it's not just filling up forms, although forms is usually the one thing that I think is difficult. There's like this sequential things that you do in, for example, in an app, in an editing tool. It's not like you count the number of clicks you need to do in order to make some things happen. And I know there are shortcuts for that, like that's why we've created macros. But there's familiarity. Once a person knows how to use a program, they will know the number of steps that they need to do in order to reach something. And I think it's time that we kind of do away with this. It's a good idea to pay attention to making things simple, but not always is it equated to making things. It does not always equate to using as less clicks as possible. Okay, the other thing is something I've noticed as well is that customers are never rational. Like, people are not logical. So you would think that if you made things better, you made things faster, people will like it. Like, for example, let's say you redesigned something. There are a lot of case studies here. I think there was one from eBay. They were changing their color. I'm not sure what else. Like when you're trying to do a rebrand. So one reaction is that whenever a change happens, there are people that are change averse. So they know that the new thing is better, but because they're so used to doing things the old way, then they wouldn't accept doing things and having to relearn things, even though it will make them more productive in a better way, for example. And I guess that comes down to preferences for people. But another example would be, let's say, our biases. So people are heavily biased in certain things. Like when you meet a person for the first time, you're already making judgments about this person, for example. And that first impression kind of sticks with you for a long time until something else happens and it messes up or changes your perspective. When I'm designing for people, for example, it's very important that you know their context, you know where they're coming from, and you know the emotions that they're feeling at a certain time. I'd give a very good example around, let's say, Google Maps. So with Google Maps or any travel service, it doesn't the best way to actually make the service better is to make things go faster and to make like your bus schedules or your train schedules or your airplanes faster, and they should arrive on time, or like that is something that we all want. But when you're waiting for your bus, for example, or the train, it makes a big difference when you know what time it's gonna arrive or when you know where it is at that current time. So when I'm using an app like Uber or Lyft or any other like ride sharing or a tool like that, even a taxi app, when I know where they are and how long it'll take them to reach me, even though it's not gonna make them come to me faster, I feel a lot better because I feel reassured that they're on their way. Kind of a thing. So that's the emotional aspect of design, and that kind of helps. The additional context just reassures people. You don't have to do it, like eventually you'll get there, but it'll make people less annoyed because they know what they're waiting for. All right, the next thing is the myth of like making things pretty. There is a valuable thing in making things pretty because people associate pretty things with usable things. So it might not be the best it might not be the best experience to use something, but I have bought a couple of tools myself and products that just look artistically good, but it doesn't really make sense for me to keep using it on a day-to-day basis just because the experience of using it is not great. So the problem with just making things pretty is if people can't use the thing that you created, how will they stay there? So an example would be like the prettiest, the tallest heels that are super steep, like this steep. They look pretty, like a display piece kind of pretty, but to walk with them would be to kill your feet. Almost. So it's not something that you would wear every single day. Or maybe like something like makeup. So I could keep wearing makeup, but then I wouldn't want to sleep with them as well. Like, it makes me look pretty, but it doesn't make sense for me to wear it every single. I don't know if that's a good comparison, but just think of the things that are just super nice to look at, but just doesn't make sense for you to keep. I'm sure you've found or experienced something similar. That the next thing I'd want to talk about is segmenting the people that use your product by age group. So it could be possible that you have a segment of customers that are very young, and then you can assume that these young people are more tech savvy. Well, there is research that suggests that it's not always the case. So an example would be there are plenty of developers and plenty of tech savvy people that are older, and so they're actually more tech savvy. So inside of those age groups, there are actually different segments of people. So again, it comes back to the idea of you have to know who's using the product and what types of people are they. You can't just generalize that these are all the people that use my product. There's no such thing. You need to know that there's a range of people, and you can group them together. But like, the more you understand like which one is using what part and what aspect, and from among those, the more you understand who you're actually targeting and you want to serve the most, then the better off you can be. And the tip that I've been getting so far is easier when you're starting out to sell to the people who have the most money. So some businesses do have that strategy. And then there's also the strategy where you sell to everyone. So selling to everyone actually has its own problems, just because like everyone has their own unique problems. Everyone will have their own different needs. So how do you make a service viable and accessible and usable to everyone? So I think there are design guidelines, and there's a book that I've read recently. How do you make sure that you're able to service that everyone aspect? And it's especially useful if you're targeting clients that work in, let's say, the government space or like the large services space. Just because there are accessibility laws coming are already in effect, and even the large enterprise clients I've heard. So I never really thought about this before, but I've been talking to people. So if your target clients are enterprise, like the really, really large enterprise type of clients, these people pay attention to accessibility because they know that they want to serve the largest market out there. And to do that, you need to have a product that can serve diverse needs. And one way to do that is to pay attention to accessibility. The most common myth that I feel everyone has is the idea that they think they are the user or they are the customer. So again, this is very wrong. And unless I am designing specifically for myself, then that would be okay. Like if I was creating something for myself, then I would be my own user. But if it's creating someone for someone else, then that someone else is not me. So I wouldn't know how they think. I wouldn't know their circumstances. I wouldn't know what they want. I wouldn't know what they need unless I talk to them and spend time with them and try to understand their context. What people need and what people want are different things, but you wouldn't really know until you start testing things out. So this is something very key. That's why I always advocate for research. So if you're in a team and you know that there's not a lot of appetite for research, then maybe point them into this direction. Try to find like stories and examples of why it's so important to understand the customers that you're serving, and why it's important to like just see how their day is going by, see what types of problems they typically encounter, see what their office setup looks like, and what times of the day do they work. These things, that the more information that you can collect, the better you can actually design solutions for the customers or the people that already love your product and the people that are going to come. So one thing that I would like to highlight is I've been talking about your customers and the people that love the product, but also the people that love the product might also be the internal staff. It might also be processes. The problem that you're solving might also be processes inside the team. So when we talk about people and users, it's not really just the customers outside. It could be everyone involved. It could be your executive group. So maybe they're looking for data and you need to provide that. In the intersection of like customers, the tech, if it's usable or not, we also need to pay attention to the needs of the business. And so something important is that we as product designers also need to be mindful of the impact of our design in the business. It's not something that everyone has, and I've met a bunch of people who are not quite familiar with how to track outcomes, how to track the money that was spent in developing a product. So I've learned that when you're creating something, obviously you're not making any money out of it until it gets launched. So there's only like a certain amount of runway until it doesn't make sense anymore. And you want to avoid situations where there's like a sunk cost fallacy where you're pursuing something that you think is good. So maybe this is another myth, just because I've seen a lot of people doing it. Because you're already in one direction and you've put a lot of effort in it, then that means you need to finish it just so that you could justify the amount of time that you spent doing that, whatever. That's something. It's actually better to actively think about when does it make sense to stop and pivot. When something is like, just think about the timelines. Think about the amount of money involved in like paying everyone's salary in order to complete a project. Is it worth it to continue on in a trajectory? Most people don't think about it because like they're not the ones paying the salary, but the business has its own runway, and that if that runs out, then people's jobs can get affected. So I'm always very mindful about like deadlines. How do we reduce scope? How can I meet the needs of the team and pivot, but still try to advocate for like basic things, like how do we validate the research? It's a constant balancing act. So I think that's like 11 myths that are worth talking about. I hope you found this very informative, and me just talking about it also brought a lot of memories in the past that sometimes it's not easy to educate people, but that's sort of part of our job in UX. It's a baby field, and even now, like I had a conversation with a person and I was trying to explain what UX is, but then they told me that like we already have a marketing department and all of our creatives are being handled by the marketing department, so we don't really need that. So it's like, how do you tell people and how do you make them listen to you when they're already so adamant that, you know, they don't need you, for example, or that your function is just part of marketing, for example. It's not like, it takes a bit of patience. Also, sometimes it's okay to just let go of some of the battles on the way, like just constantly chugging at it and then also showing results help a lot. So I really hope that if you're facing the same problems and you find people in your team and even outside of the team having these very same sort of mindset or thinking, like all the myths here, one day I hope that you will be able to disprove it. Alright, I think I rambled on there. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.